Wow, is this working? Hopefully it is. Okay. Another game theory video. Long little ramble thing. ASMR. Relax while I complain about games. So anyway, another game theory video. Today let's talk about how fighting games have progressed or tried to progress throughout the years. Whether or not that be through the game systems themselves or the characters, as well as whether or not it's even possible for games to continue to progress or to evolve in the first place. Which too long didn't read or didn't watch. I do not think that games have many opportunities to progress anymore. And it's another reason why fundamentals are so important in games, to keep in games because of this. And it's especially made even worse with this, so much of this one step forward, one step back, or even two steps back at certain points, right? So as usual, take everything I say with a bit of a grain of salt, but hopefully you can roll with me and kind of see the idea that I'm getting at, as I'm going to try to come at this from a lot of different angles, right? So first, let's talk about what is one of the ways that fighting games tried to progress as a genre in the first place, right? As a genre, whatever English, right? Well, that would be with, in fact, something like combos, right? There was a backlash against something simple, quotation marks, right? Something simple that had too much of an influence on the match, whether or not that be something like a fireball, dragon punch trap, a throw mix up, whatever. Combos getting bigger in some way are a way to combat this. But we start to run into that one step forward, one step back here very quickly in games, right? Combos are getting bigger in some perspective. Combos getting bigger in some perspective is a necessary quotation mark evil, right? If you can even call it that. But while developers were adding bigger combos to make those quotation mark simple things have less of an influence on the match, they also started toning down the simple things. DPs became less invincible. Things like air blocking was added. We started allowing characters to roll on the ground, delayed get up. The fireballs were getting slower. Hell, at some point, we've gotten to a stage in fighting games where to even get a DP to be invincible, we have to use meter. It's gotten ridiculous, right? But okay, time out. Let's stop here for a second and think about something. What's really going on here, right? Let's take a look back at games like Super Turbo. As much as people complain that simple things like a fireball or a dragon punch had too much of an influence on the match, didn't we also have many other characters in that game who also have their own version, if you will, of something quotation marks simple that has a potential drastic effect on the match, right? So is this whole one step forward, one step back actually even necessary? Of course it's not. So now we start getting into the idea of character progression, right? Since we have toned down so many quotation marks, simple elements of characters, we now need to make characters more versatile, right? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but again, roll with the idea that I'm going here, right? But then we get into now the dangers of progression, as ultimately there's only so many things you can do with a character in a video game, right? As we are making these characters more and more versatile, inevitably perhaps they start to actually become more similar. For every new spin on a character that we start throwing at someone, we start running into this one step forward, one step back things as they start to start doing something that maybe another character had, right? Besides even old characters, how many times do you see a new character introduced into a game where when you think of them and how they brought a new perspective on the game, right? For a while, sure, there was something like, all the Final Fight characters, Gen was cool and Street Fighter, all that kind of stuff. All those characters are well done, and I think you can look at characters like that in a Street Fighter game and be like, wow, that's a new perspective on what a character can be, right? King of Fighters has reinvented so many of their characters so many times. They did it so well. And hell, some of their reinventions of the characters were actually better than their originals, I think, in my opinion, right? But again, we eventually run into this thing is there's only so much progress that can be made with a character before we start feeling like this new character or this new thing we're giving a character, they're just kind of being mishmashed together. They're not actually totally new. It's not a totally new perspective on what a video game can be, right? And watch that narrative of emotion video I talked about when I talked about game theory, because being able to change your perspective is a very important narrative when we talk about video games. But again, this is a danger of progression, right? So let's move to something else for a bit, okay? One of the only legitimate potential ways for games to progress is actually the game system itself, right? And I want to give some examples once again as to why it's so important now to have these kind of core fundamentals in games, right? So let's take a game like Guilty Gear. Guilty Gear is one of the most important fighting games ever, right? Somehow in a sea of fighting game clones, ever since Street Fighter II was originally released, and I think in the main minds of the FGC, you have something like, Street Fighter, King of Fighters, Fatal Fury, or let's just say SNK, right? Or Mortal Kombat, right? And then you have, in fact, Guilty Gear, right? Somehow Guilty Gear went from surviving as a series to succeeding. And it started to succeed when you could finally see the Street Fighter in Guilty Gear, right? Which, go watch how my Dustloop saved Guilty Gear to get some, give me some views on that. Give me my fucking $5 off YouTube. I'm trying. So you could see through these fundamental Street Fighter sort of mindsets, right? You can learn about Guilty Gear and all, it's for sake of argument here, quotation marks, new to fighting games. The system mechanics that were, again, quotation marks, new to fighting games, right? These system mechanics and all the new things you can do with it now and how it threw a new spin on what fighting games could be is very important, right? So a reason why Guilty Gear is now one of the most important fighting games today, besides having some of the goodwill of Street Fighter in it, is these system quirks, right? How it threw a new spin on what fighting games could be, okay? And I think Guilty Gear succeeded in its mechanics as well, because in that very fine line of having a system mechanics be the narrative of a game for better or worse, Guilty Gear's system mechanics also made the characters, the progression of what a character could be, better. So I want you to think about this, right? When you are thinking about something like RC, FRC, etc., are you thinking about the game when you think about that? Or are you thinking about what the character does with Guilty Gear's mechanics more so? Do you see what I'm getting at? I'm going to use some comparisons here, for example. Think about a game like Street Fighter Alpha 2. And Lord knows, I know a lot of you dudes, or at least there's a little bit of a cult following. They got a huge hard-on for Alpha 2. But bear with me, because I'm trying to talk about the progression of games here, right? Which again, game systems are some of the only legitimate way of progressing a video game, right? Nowadays, basically, right? When you think about Street Fighter Alpha 2, are you thinking about how cool and how amazing the custom combos were? What's more, are you thinking about how amazing custom combos are for this one specific character versus another? And, don't give me some bullshit like Rolento does Pogo and his Pogo CC instantly kills you. I'm not, fuck that for a second, right? Again, roll with me. Point is, generally, no, you don't. There's a negative narrative to Alpha 2 when it comes to the new game system mechanics that it brought to fighting games. Whereas in Guilty Gear, do you ever hear people back in the day talk about how FRC, RC ruined Guilty Gear as a game? Let alone the character? No, because the game system of Guilty Gear also benefited the individuality, that's a big word, the individuality and expression of the characters in the game. Another great example is on this other side of the coin of how important system mechanics can be in fundamentals is look at a game like Dragon Ball FighterZ. I've said it many times. Dragon Ball FighterZ is one of the biggest, if not potentially the biggest ever dropped ball in the history of fighting games. You had an opportunity here to bring something new to what a fighting game could be. Hell, the mechanics are so different In Dragon Ball Fighter Z, you aren't even completely restricted by former character archetypes. You could create totally new ones in Dragon Ball Fighter Z with this whole tug of war between homing dash, fireball, reflecting, blah, blah, blah. But then look, the game has such god-awful fucking fundamentals. We don't even have characters that even take advantage of these specific mind games in the way that they should. So the game is completely fucked up. But even saying that and all its failures, it still illustrates exactly why I think in the grand scheme of things, for the most part, I think fighting games are running out of opportunities to progress as a genre, whatever. Character-wise specifically, right? Too, but. And some of the only opportunities to progress is when you add a new system into the game. But you need to make sure that you stay true and respect all these other core fundamental aspects of what made fighting games popular in the first place. Because this is what you should be building off of, right? Anyway, I know I've been rambling on here for a while now, and I haven't even touched upon the subject of how progression in terms of fighting games has gone executionally speaking. It's a complete travesty. The constant need to make things easier, trying to take the skill and execution out of the game, the constant desire to make games more pre-planned and contrived have all hurt games for the worse considerably, right? But, I've been talking here for a while, so I'll just stop right there. But certainly I think this shows why I think it's important to have, as well, different styles of games, right? Because there is no perfect game ever, as I've said many times before, right? All games have their good, all games have their bad, right? With different systems, right? And the different characters, we can throw. And when you have like a different system, this is why I think, it's important to have different games. You can't just all have like a Street Fighter 2 game. It can't all just be like a verse game. These different kind of ideas of games are important, right? Because, with these different kind of like game systems, different types of characters can exist in them, or we can throw new spins on certain characters to keep them fresh in those new game systems, right? There's those different kind of game systems, right? But, at the end of the day, again, we need to make sure that we keep these core fundamentals in games and build off those fundamentals. And sadly, generally, that's just not the case in games nowadays. But anyway, I've been rambling here for a while, so I could keep talking about this, but a little game theory video. Hopefully you guys got what I'm talking about and, how the game system. It's important for the game system to show off the characters, not necessarily the game, right? Because, when I'm talking about this narrative of games, this also does get into that, how a character can show off the narrative of the game. A character shows off, the story. You don't want, the game system is supposed to be important, but you want the characters to be able to use that game system. You don't want the game system, like I showed Alpha 2, was a bad narrative because of custom combos. Whereas Guilty Gear had a potential good narrative because when you think about the game system of a game like Guilty Gear, you think about the character using the game system, not the game system necessarily itself. Does that make sense? Anyway, the end for now.